Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Capacity Building International webinar series on stability policing to resilient communities. My name is Kyle King and I am the Managing Director of Capacity Building International. We just call it CBI. And really, thank you very much for attending. Thank you for registering and thank you for being here. This is the first part of what we hope to be many webinar series coming up discussing the challenges that we have in the international community and that we face in trying to build more resilient and stable societies. That sounds like a lot, I understand, but I promise it's really not that in depth, and we're going to cover quite a lot of information. But first, I wanted to just do a quick introduction. So this is basically 20 years of my life. So I'm, again, like I said, I'm the managing director of CBI. And the important takeaway here is the fact that I've worked in consistently 3 different conflict areas, from Bosnia to Afghanistan and with KFOR. And most recently with KFOR in Kosovo, that was with NATO. And I spent about 7 years with NATO in a security sector reform and capacity building function. In 2017, I started Capacity Building International. And our main goal is really, besides international programs and development, is to bring this type of experience and information back to our academic and professional partners in the US and then Europe, and to be able to enable these type of discussions about what it takes to be able to resolve conflict, build capacities, and create stable societies, more resilient societies in these crisis areas. And that information is not often known inside the US and not often well known at a practitioner level in Europe itself. And so my background itself, so I come out of the crisis management sphere and work in conflict and crisis management. That's been my background for the last 20 years. But before we get started, I want to just address a few topics. Number one, the first one is, why are we even doing this? And somebody asked me that question the other day, and it really comes down to a couple of key points for us. Number one, there is a wealth of information out there, from webinars to documents to everything else, about the geopolitical, strategic, international security policy issues. And those discussions are happening nearly every day. But what we have noticed, and what my team and I have noticed, is that we don't see a lot of discussion about what happens after policy. What happens post-policy decision? How does it go forward and actually is executed? So when people are sitting in Brussels and they're working at a committee level and they make a decision, and they've come up with all the right terminology and they've refined it 1,000 times, and they say, instead of and, it's but, or if, or when, and they change all of these terms, how is that translated to tangible, concrete results in the field? And who does that? And that's where my experience has come in. And so I have taken the policy level documents and converted that into tangible effects on the ground, which were then measured and sent back up to be able to say we've accomplished our mission. And that entire spectrum is what people don't get a lot of insight in. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to start having these kind of discussions. Post-policy decision to practitioner level, what we call the strategic to the operational level, the practitioner level, and then what it takes to create these kind of effects. What do the policies mean tangibly on the ground? I use this example quite a lot, but say you get a policy or a political guidance that says we want you to go forth and build integrity in Afghanistan. Now, everybody is all for building integrity programs and transparency, but the challenge of doing that in another culture, in another society with completely different standards, is a real issue that we face every day. And so these are the kind of discussions we want to have. This was one of our motivations. The second motivation that we have is that we have NATO partners. We have colleagues that we work with in NATO, and we wanted to help them disseminate this information to our academic and professional partners. We wanted to provide a platform where we can engage in this discussion, this wide-ranging discussion about the challenges we face as the international community. And so we wanted to open a discussion for practitioners that also disseminate information to make people more aware of the challenges we face. Those are our 2 reasons that we wanted to have these kind of webinars and functions to moving forward. So getting in a bit to our webinar structure, this is a 4-part series webinar structure. I'll get into that in just a few minutes. or in just a couple of seconds. I don't want to take a lot of time just to introduce this, but it's a 4-part structure, and it is coinciding with a NATO Stability Policing Center of Excellence annual conference. And this conference, the topic is the spoilers in stability policing. But when we were designing this webinar series, we couldn't just dive into the topic of stability policing. We felt that we had to provide an introduction into this. And then we also wanted to cover what we believe is a spectrum of resilience. So a society that goes from conflict to crisis and needs to go back into a stable society again. So we've structured this webinar in such a way that we have a top-level overview on the challenges with the future of warfare. And then we get into how NATO is addressing stability policing. And then we get into how do we develop host nation capabilities so that we may one day be able to lead. And that is the conversation that needs to happen more, not only how do we start or get involved in other countries in the conflict, but how do we get out? And because of that relationship with NATO, because of that relationship with the COE, we are being provided, and in turn CBI will provide to you, since you're attending this webinar, a special link, which you will be able to then watch the live stream of this conference. Now, of course, you won't be able to watch the entire conference because there's many different venues, but you'll be able to see some of the discussions they're having in Italy about the spoilers. And if you're like me, you'll be surprised as to what they are. Environmental crimes, organized crime, the lack of judicial systems. There's just a ton of things that are complications and roadblocks towards building more resilient societies. And you'll be provided a link as we get closer to that conference date, and you'll be able to take a look at that. And that's just because you're here with us today in this webinar special. So that's our special bonus that we're going to be providing you, and we're really looking forward to that ourselves. So again, this is about stability policing to community resilience. And so it's a 4-part webinar series designed to open this discussion about how do we not only fill that security gap, but then how do we also move forward to getting out of that country as well and leaving in its place stable, resilient societies. It is a broad discussion, and we are basically going to start with today's episode on the changing nature of warfare. And I'll get into who's presenting that in just a second, but I'm going to provide a quick overview of what we're looking at as far as the series. So we're starting top level, changing nature of warfare, and how is it that warfare and the nature of warfare is changing over time, and what can we predict in the future? Where is the conflict taking us, so to speak? From my perspective, coming out of civilian crisis management, I see more and more that conflict is infringing upon civilian capabilities, and NATO doesn't necessarily have, or the international community doesn't necessarily have, a structured capability to respond to and help mitigate these gaps. So that's something that we'll be discussing. Episode 2, coming up in the following week, is the actual introduction to NATO Stability Policing. This is going to be where we hear how NATO is specifically addressing the stability policing gaps and the capabilities that NATO has to resolve these type of issues within the crisis response operation that they're functioning in. And so we're covering the geopolitical piece, the origin story, so to speak, of why stability policing came about. Then we're talking about how NATO is addressing that capability gap. And then we get into episode 3, which is the role of the U.S. Department of Justice ICTAP program, and what is the U.S. Department of Justice doing to help rebuild rule of law and rebuild these civilian capabilities. And that's critically important in this case. And so if we ever want to transition, we have to have a civilian or a host nation capability to hand over authority. And that is exactly where our partners like the U.S. and the Department of Justice come in. And then we're going to talk about how do we build host nation capabilities, how do we get them to be more resilient and effective, and then how do we build them into a community engagement and community resiliency programs so that they are more stable and able to function independently. Episode 4 is going to be a Q&A and discussion on community engagement, and this is where your help is going to be quite beneficial. Well, we actually need you to be there. But if you have any questions during this process, simply send me an email. These are going to be automated recordings because of the fact that we are in so many different time zones. But this last episode we want to have as a live discussion, but please do send questions to info@capacitybuildingint.com. Send me information or send me any requests, comments, concerns, or again, questions about what you want us to address. what are the topics, or if you have a question for the Department of Justice or for NATO or for Dr. Carlucci, who's coming up, send that to me. And we will have a fourth session. This will be after the first two. This will be after the conference and after our discussion with the Department of Justice. And so this will be our final event, and we're going to answer any questions and try and link this entire spectrum together in our discussions. So first, starting out, we're going to have Dr. Pascal Carlucci with us. He's from Coventry University in the UK. He's a strategist and lecturer in international relations at Coventry University and has been heavily involved in stability policing and NATO strategic communications for quite a while now, and is going to provide us with that overview, that topical strategic overview, and the origins of where these capability gaps are coming from and what the future might actually look like. So we're going to start that in just a second, so just stay tuned, and we'll be starting that in just a second. Okay, and we're back, and now I'd like to welcome Dr. Pascal Carlucci from Coventry University. Dr. Carlucci, how are you this morning?
Thank you. Fine. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Yes, no problem. So I have already kind of gone through and given an introduction, so we can just dive right into the presentation of what you're presenting us today, which is the changing character of war. Very interesting topic, and looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, Kyle. So today's presentation is about the changing character of war, and specifically the policing dimension. I thought that this would be a great way to introduce the subject of stability policing. Also because stability policing always, lacks a little bit of theoretical conceptualization. And I thought that giving students the chance to explore stability policing within the realm of this discipline may give them more tools to ask relevant questions about strategic issues that affect stability policing. So I really hope this presentation gives the right coordinates for you to start thinking about the issue. So next slide. So today's webinar will be touching 6 main points. First of all is the concept and the idea of continuity in war. And second is definition of irregular warfare and stability operations. Third will be, we will be discussing about people-centric warfare and enemy-centric warfare. Fourth, how did we move from traditional to multidimensional peacekeeping? Fifth, the very concept of stability policing. And number 6, the future. And I believe that we will close this webinar with the discussion with the moderator. Next slide, please. So the key question and the key definition about war is was given by Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian general. I'm sure you're all familiar with him. But everything that we studied about war after his work, it basically has been largely influenced by his book, who, by the way, it's called On War, was published by his wife after his death. And there is a very interesting book about how Clausewitz's wife managed to publish all of his notes, because he was an officer teaching at a staff academy in Prussia. And all these notes were supposed to educate the future leaders of the Prussian army. So it's a very interesting story, besides the very concept of war. So for Karl von Clausewitz, war is the continuation of policy by other means. What does that imply? It means that everything we do in war must be linked to the policy and the objectives that we want to achieve. So every time you want to evaluate a certain asset, a certain concept, a certain unit, you should always think how that creates the effect the policy wants to achieve, the objective that the policy wants to achieve. This is why it's fundamental always to look back at Clausewitz when we think about war, because it gives that predominance to politics. Ultimately, war is about politics. It's the continuation of it by other means. So this is extremely important, even when we think about stability policing, because as you will see in the definitions that I will give you, stability policing is the result also of theoretical development. Then we jump back to our days with the work of Thomas X. Ames, who's a former United States Marine, who wrote a book on fourth generation warfare. And his definition of fourth generation warfare is that warfare uses all available networks, political, economic, social, and military, to convince the enemy's decision makers that their strategic goals are either unachievable or too costly for the perceived benefit. What does this mean? If you're an insurgent or a terrorist, your strategy will be based on discouraging military coalitions that their goal will be too costly, will be too hard, okay? And this is a blend between political and psychological at the same time. And they will use all possible means available to them, which means that if you have to strike insurgents and terrorists, you have to be able and capable to deploy all means necessary within a vast realm of instruments available to statecraft to defeat insurgents and terrorists. So this means that perhaps the military alone is not always able to achieve the result on its own, but it needs several other means, policing being one of them. Now, policing can be part of the military solution, or it can be a solution that is presented alongside the military one, okay? So these two definitions give a sense, in my view, of the challenge that we have today. On one hand, we have to make sure that at operational level, we achieve political goals. And whatever we do at operational level needs to be linked to the ultimate political goal. And also that whatever we do in operation needs to take into consideration a whole variety of dimensions. This is what fourth generation warfare is all about. I encourage you to read Thomas X. Ames' book, The Sling and the Stone. If you haven't, I suggest you read it, because it also explains the kind of challenges the US military encounter both in Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of stabilizing these two countries. Next slide, please. Yep. So, irregular warfare and stability operations. Irregular warfare, a violent struggle among state and non-state actors for legitimacy and influence over relevant population. This is a definition of the US military. What does this mean? Violent struggle among state and non-state actors. Well, first of all, in order to defeat a non-state opponent, you need to gain legitimacy and influence over a population. Now, are conventional military means shaped to gain legitimacy and influence over relevant populations? It depends. Stability policing is certainly at the forefront of that, in trying to get legitimacy and influence over relevant population, because it is a solution designed to deal with people instead of conquering enemy territory, maneuver warfare. No, they are about protecting the population, building institution, and also giving them the possibility to lead a normal life with no security threat. So as you see in irregular warfare, which generally is portrayed as the realm of non-conventional warriors, special forces, it's actually a lot broader than that. And it can also involve the use of police units. And this is a very innovative way of looking at irregular warfare. The definition of stability operation is an overarching term encompassing various military missions, tasks, and activities conducted outside the United States in coordination with other instruments of national power to maintain or reestablish a safe and secure environment, provide essential government services, emergency infrastructure, reconstruction, and humanitarian relief. So this is a little bit what we were discussing before about fourth generation warfare. In a sense, stability operations are designed to meet that specific context, to meet that specific challenge. But as you see, in its definition, in its very definition, stability operations need to maintain and reestablish a safe and secure environment. Now, who is best placed to do that, if not security, if not police forces? This is why, in a sense, the concept of stability operation and the concept of stability policing kind of evolved together over the past 20 years. So in both irregular warfare and stability operations, you see the two dimensions that we discussed before about Clausewitz and fourth generation warfare. On one hand, the politics of war, the politics of irregular warfare require getting legitimacy and influence. Stability operations as a subset of that require to maintain and reestablish a safe and secure environment. They go in much depth and they require a certain skill set. It doesn't say it here, but you can already see through these definitions why we may need something like stability policing. Next slide, please. And here's the main question, one of the main questions in the irregular warfare debate. Should we concentrate, should we focus on the enemy, on the population? So in countering insurgency and terrorism, should our efforts be focused on securing the population or defeat the enemy? Can we do both at the same time? Now, you cannot expect that the people who are trained to defeat an enemy, especially an irregular one, would be the same ones who have the task of securing a certain population. And what we have done in the previous long experiences in both in Iraq and Afghanistan is believing that the same force could do both. Now, for example, I can give an example in my professional life. What we tried to do in Afghanistan was build a police force, a national police force, during the transition. I was there for 4.5 years. Now, this was a very bitter debate within the international community. On one hand, there were people saying police forces are, the best tool and the best asset to defeat insurgents, to defeat the Taliban, because they concentrate on legitimacy and influence over a certain population. But it was the way that we wanted police to fight insurgency that was perhaps not compatible to the two-folded missions we had in front of us. Now, we had the Afghan National Army that was quite skilled at conducting operations against the Taliban. But we kind of wanted the police to have this ambiguous role between fighting insurgency and protecting the population, which was never solved, I think, not in the years that I was there. And that's a typical example of the type of operational challenges you have on the ground. And also, it is the biggest debate we have right now in irregular warfare. You know, shall we design a multi-dimensional, multitasking force, or shall we have smaller subset that are able to do things that are very specific? I'll leave the answer to you. Perhaps this could be a discussion within your seminars and classes, but you know, striking a balance between an enemy-centric and a population-centric operation, I think, is one of the key issues, especially in counterinsurgency. And you also have to ask yourself if you could do them at the same time. I'll leave the answer to you. Next slide, please. Well, traditional to multi-dimensional peacekeeping. Now, generally, stability policing is understood as being part of the realm of peacekeeping. Now, as you may know, the peacekeeping has evolved, peacekeeping operations evolved in the last 50 years. They've evolved greatly. At the beginning, there was what was called traditional peacekeeping, conducted with the consent of parties to a conflict, usually states, or non-state actors, which blue helmets, who are the peacekeeper, monitored the truce between warring sides, mediated to seek a political solution to underline a conflict. Now, this is not the type of scenarios you had in the 90s. And it is in the 90s where the international community started to see why traditional peacekeeping was outdated, that you needed new means, new culture to protect civilians. If you look at the cases from Somalia, the collapse of Yugoslavia, the genocide in Rwanda, those were huge failures at the beginning of the 90s, which led to a very deep discussion on what to do to secure the population, because there wasn't consent of the parties to the conflict. The truce wasn't there, so you had to deploy a force in order to find that truce, and most of the times you couldn't find it. Mediation was happening during war, during conflict. So traditional peacekeeping was updated. Now we've gone from that to what we have today, which is multi-dimensional peacekeeping, which comprises a mix of military, police, and civilian components working together to lay the foundations of sustainable peace. And that required a whole variety of measures. One of them was the concept of responsibility to protect, which not only affects the very concept of humanitarian intervention, but it also affects mandates. Now, peacekeeping missions have the mandates to protect civilians, and they can do that if they think civilians' lives are at risk. And they have been given the tools. So not only military units who are trained professionally to conduct peacekeeping, but also police forces who are able to conduct police roles, and civilian experts who can tackle the very causes of conflict, while at the same time generating programs and projects that will sustain peace in a long time. So the UN has gone a long way from the early 90s. It has evolved hugely. Now, it doesn't seem like types of multidimensional peacekeeping today are high in demand, but they do, but they remain in certain theaters. So Mali, Central African Republic certainly are examples of multidimensional peacekeeping. So I encourage you to look at these mandates and what the UN is doing over there. Next slide, please. Now, stability policing. Now, during the stabilization of Yugoslavia, both the UN and NATO had a problem. And the problem was the security gap. Now, they have deployed military forces who could very well keep the warring parties from all-out war and from fighting each other in a traditional way. But there wasn't a force design to protect the population or making sure that public order was upheld. That security gap wasn't met by individual civilian police officers deployed under the UN International Police Task Force. It wasn't performed by infantry brigades deployed in Western Balkans, simply because they didn't have the skill. So you had that gap. Very practically, the leaders, military leaders in ex-Yugoslavia and also planners at NATO headquarters saw a solution, and that solution was the Italian Carabinieri. The Italian Carabinieri are police force with military status. In Italy, they perform all policing tasks, and at the same time, they are also military police. They are the fourth armed force of Italy. So their added value was that they could be deployed in a regiment size, for example, like in Yugoslavia or in Kosovo. They could be deployed. They could function in a military chain of command, and they could perform all policing tasks in a unit. So that was the first experience. Now, Carabinieri had been deployed in Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, and then later on in Iraq in 2003. That was the multinational specialized unit by the Carabinieri, who also, by the way, had similar police forces from other countries. Now, this led to the development of the concept of stability policing in NATO, and also the concept of formed police units in the United Nations. So what is stability policing? Policing, as I put here in a slide, stability policing are police-related activities intended to reinforce or temporarily replace indigenous police in order to contribute to the restoration and or upholding of public order and security, rule of law, and the protection of human rights. So you have a full spectrum police force who can either replace police forces that are not existent on the ground, and frequently that is the case, especially in failed states, or they can even strengthen and train local police forces in case they lack certain capabilities. So you have a very flexible tool. So this is the development of stability policing and why we have stability policing today. And this is why I think this development is an excellent case study to see how the international community had reacted to a specific need on the ground. And this is what we should focus on. How do we address operational needs on the ground? So during the conference, you will learn how several experts view this, the evolution of stability policing in the future. I have thought about what could be the possible vehicles for a discussion on stability policing. Next slide, please. All right, so these are, in my view, the vehicles of possible change in the field of stability policing. We need to think about policing in broader sense, which involves different domains, sea, air, and cyber. Criminal activities not only stick on the ground, they can be everywhere. So stability policing needs to be, present in all domains of conflict. Or we need to think about what could stability policing do in all domains. And this is, I think, a great challenge that they have, especially at the Center of Excellence. The employment of new technology now. People today are different than people in the 90s. They have smartphones, and even law enforcement have access to a broader range of new technologies. These could be incorporated. Also, if you think about the managing of riots, could be improved by use of new technologies. The third is the likelihood of large stability operation. Now, the concept of stability policing is the result of years of operations. Years of operations where police forces were high in demand in Africa and other parts of the world. Now, today we need to ask whether we will have these large stability operations, especially ones of the size like Iraq and Afghanistan. Other countries are also imitating NATO. For example, in Syria, Russia had deployed something similar to the MSU in Syria, patrolling the streets of Aleppo. So we have to see what will be the future demand for these units and how this concept can evolve to meet operational requirements on the ground. And with that, I finish, and I invite you to think about these three future trends. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I know it was a big request to give us a political strategic kind of overview, and to do so and in 30 minutes is a pretty big challenge. So I very much appreciate that. And I think, there's just a couple of questions that I think that I've been hearing, that I hear as well in my work, that that we can possibly just address, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. So you've identified, and correctly so, that in former Yugoslavia there was the gap between what the UN was doing and then also what NATO was capable of delivering. And then from that gap, stability policing was developed. But when I consider and I look at NATO and the international community, are we really considering this continuing nature, this continuing changing nature of warfare? And do you feel in any way that we're still sort of stuck with the old mentalities and models? And I asked that question not in a negative aspect, but because in my experience in talking with nations in NATO is the fact that, we have sometimes a very traditional mindset. If it's not one of our political, military, economic, or civilian tools of NATO, we don't want to develop new capabilities. And you've probably heard that quite a bit yourself. And so there's always a balance of capabilities and budget. And so do you really think, as far as question one goes here, do you really think that the international community is considering this, even though we have the existing constraints?
I think the international, it depends what we mean by the international community and NATO. I think they are aware. Mm-hmm. I think they are aware. What's getting in between what's in their mind and what they do in the ground is large institutions, large bureaucracies, a certain sense of maintaining a certain coherence also in what they do, which sometimes is not the case. If reality is changing quite fast. Mm-hmm. So what you really need to do is developing new institutions that are more flexible and likely to respond quicker to the challenges they are confronted with. I think the will is there, but it's getting from awareness to action. It's problematic today. So I think there are people that are willing to consider new things, but the role that they have forces them to think about problems in a traditional way. if they had other means, they probably would think differently. They will look for innovative solutions. So what we have to think really is that are the institutions that we have at the moment built and conceived in a way that they can meet the challenges in a fast way. I think this is the real challenge. NATO, for example, specifically NATO has been quite, especially in recent years, been quite smart about understanding certain challenges. But getting from understanding these challenges to actually doing something about it, it's very problematic.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think if, from a practitioner perspective, and as we've talked previously, going from this strategic political discussion, post-policy, post-decision, and then being in the field and implementing in a practitioner perspective, the terms of capabilities is always coming up. So if we get a political tasking to go out and to create a capability or to stabilize environment or build resilient communities or whatever the tasking might be, on paper, that's often, it looks far better than what it is when you're actually working in the field and trying to develop these capacities and these aspects of society, these institutions. So I often, along in lines with question one, with question two, if we are changing, what can we expect in terms of capabilities? And I think that's where maybe you just highlighted that there's a will there, but actually delivering something tangible to address that is quite challenging. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's I think we have to construct this sort of new model of forging capabilities when we need them. So we need to come up with the doctrine, first a theory and then a doctrine on how to assemble the right skills to perform certain duties when we need them. If we can do that, NATO will be really, again, the best equipped international organization to deal with the security threat. So I think this is the main challenges. How quickly can you go from will to action?
All right. Yeah, definitely. And well, in that case, that's where I think in terms of policing, we were fortunate to have countries like Italy, right? That already have and have had for a long time a national capability and a very strong foundation from which to build a new capability. But as and you've mentioned, I think you called it the fourth dimension or fourth generation warfare. That's really, when I look at that from a civilian kind of crisis management perspective and civilian emergency planning perspective, I see there's just going to be more, and encroachment's kind of a negative term, but there's just more that NATO might have to do with regards to inherently civilian capabilities. And it's not going to be the same as with Italy, where you have a nation or two that has an organic capability already. It's going to be more complicated, and then it's going to be an issue of how do we address these future civilian gaps. And I think one of the examples that I was given was that sometimes it's not just having the police there, it's the fact that you need judges.
Yeah.
So and that's inherently a civilian host nation issue, right? That is at its core function of rule of law. And yet, how can we address that? So what are your thoughts or your perspective on these future civilian gaps?
Well, having been a civilian myself in these operations like you, I kind of feel what you say, and I agree. Well, I think the main issues here is to strike a balance. Okay, on one hand, you could very easily propose a civilian NATO corps. okay, with its recruitment, its training, and everything. But I think that would kind of undermine the flexibility side of it, because once you've been recruited and you work full time with NATO, you are no longer a civilian expert. You know, you become a NATO civil servant, all right?
Right.
So you become standardized, and in a sense, what you were saying right now is we need certain tools who are not particularly standardized, but who are able to bring whatever they have, whatever they can bring from civilian life into an integrated, multi-dimensional, perhaps, NATO operation. So I think what we need is a network, a network that kind of seeks for certain expertises and able to assess them, get them ready for an operation, and then send them out. Helped by regulations, of course, but sort of a deployable pool, but more institutionalized than existing pools. And especially trying always to look for people who can bring exactly what the operation needs, who are able to do that very quickly. The case of judges is tricky, and we'll have to evaluate whether we're going to need judges in the long run, or whether it should be NATO to actually have that, have that side. For example, the European Union has done that, and UN has done that. So I feel sometimes NATO has kind of a sense of its limits, saying, all right, we can do up to here, but then for this we need somebody else. So perhaps the OSCE could do something like this, and I think to some extent they already do it. But what we need is having the right capabilities at the right time, and you need to have a specific mechanism to identify these skills and deploy them rapidly if you need them. So I think this is what we need at the moment.
Right.
Professionalization, but not integration. Something like this.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I definitely don't think NATO should do everything. And there's certainly, in that comprehensive operational planning process, there's room for many other organizations to have a particular role. It's just an interesting perspective when it starts to encroach upon, let's just say, the more hard security piece. And there's this bit of this gray area that NATO tends to get involved in operationally in the field, but we don't necessarily have a capability to directly address. And so that's where it's interesting. And we could really just discuss this at depth, but we're starting to run out of time. So I really appreciate your time today to kind of have this top level discussion with us, the theoretical discussion, and give us kind of the origin stories of where stability policing has come from. And my introduction previously probably didn't really do a lot of justice. So where can we find more about your work and what you're doing, and to get some more information about the programs that you have?
Right. So I think there's a web page of the university with my contacts. So if anybody wants to get in touch, especially if you're thinking also about writing pieces or dissertations on policing, my contacts are online. I'm available if you want to chat about these issues. I'm currently writing a book on policing in irregular warfare. It should be out next year. I'm writing something about interventionism as well. So these are a bit my topics. Also, what we are developing at Coventry University is an MPA in international policing, Master in Public Administration. So if you want to look for a postgraduate level education in the field of international policing in order to be able to work in the kind of environment we have discussed today, you can contact me, and I think that program will be running in London, if I'm not mistaken. So, I mean, you can think about it. You can come over here. It will be half residential, so there will be weeks here in London, but also portions of the course you can take online. So it is, if it is something that you consider for your future studies, please get in touch with me.
Oh, definitely. That sounds like a very good program, actually. That sounds amazing. So, so just to kind of close out the webinar. So what's next? So mark the date for next webinar. That will be next week. Email any of your questions to info@capacitybuildingint.com, or note in the webinar question function, which will be down below this video and where that's playing. Share the information to help start a larger conversation on these topics, especially for practitioners and that operational level discussion that we want to have. And of course, if you have any problems or any technical issues, or if you have any comments, suggestions, recommendations, go ahead and send them to that same email address at info@capacitybuildingint.com. Again, we're going to queue up all the questions for our fourth Q&A webinar series, and that's where we're going to address all these different specific questions that come in, because all the different time zones, these are recorded webinar sessions. So again, thank you very much for attending, Dr. Carlucci. Thank you very much for giving us your time and your insight, and I very much appreciate your support.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
You too.